Hey everybody, we're back again. It's the Rebel Show. So, hope everyone's doing well. It's Christmas next week. Well, it's probably after Christmas when I post this, but I'm recording this before Christmas. So I hope everyone has a great Christmas. It's been a good snowy season here in Colorado. I like a lot of snow. I kind of like extreme weather. I don't know why. I just don't like being stuck in traffic. So if I can have extreme weather and not be stuck in traffic, I would be happy. All right, I don't know why I told you all that, but here we go. So we've been talking about the cycle of civilizations and how the civilizations will go from like a concentrated power to a separated power back to concentrated power because it's so hard to keep freedom. You know, people have the tendency to want to, when things are good, to give responsibility away. And that leads to tyranny, and that leads to people coming in and getting elected. And a lot of times, and they want to help, so they say, we will take on this responsibility instead of you do it. And before long, you've lost your freedoms. And so that's what we want to avoid in the United States. And that's why we have to talk about history and talk about things that have happened so that we know what's happened before and what the red flags are for when they happen. So that's what we're doing. So here we go. So Nero, he was a king back in the day, in AD 64 through 68, described monarchy as the most natural form of government. And it's true. That's the way we tend to lean most of the time on this planet. A monarchy is a state having a form of government in which the supreme power is vested in a single person, a government by the absolute will of the monarch or king. So he writes the law, he enforces the law, and he punishes those who he thinks breaks the law. So that's bad news. So Thomas Jefferson said, no king or tyrant, no dictator can govern for them as well as they can govern for themselves. That's what they thought, is that people can govern themselves, and we don't need a king to make the decisions for us. We don't need the smart intellectuals to make decisions for us. We're capable of figuring out what needs to be done. This is true today with the Union of States. We, the people, can govern ourselves in each state. We do not need an oppressive federal government. And that's important to realize with a bunch of states defecting and starting to say that their electoral votes go to the popular winner. That's taking the vote and the individuality of the people, and that's taking your state out of the election, because there's like 5 or 6 counties with the added together have the majority of the population on the whole country. So what about the smaller states? I think it's Montana has like 1 million people. So because they don't have a lot of electoral votes, they need, as a state, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit, but it's important to realize we can govern ourselves, and we need our governing power to stay intact and not let ourselves and our corrupt leaders take that away. And that's what's happening in a lot of states, including Colorado. So William Penn said, those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants. And is that true? You think that? I mean, the children of Israel did not want to be ruled by God. And look what happened. They got a bunch of terrible kings that were bad to the people. God would have treated them good. Look what he did getting them out of slavery. Look how he provided for them as they went through the wilderness. God treated people good. But they didn't want God to rule them. So they were ruled by tyrants. William Penn was right on. So we see this in Scripture. Like I just said, the Israelites didn't want God to lead them. They wanted a king. And the kings oppressed them. Plus, without direction from God, other nations conquered them often. When God was with them as they took the land, as they took the promised land, they had to take it increment by increment because they weren't a very big people and it was a very vast land. And so they had to go in and take a little at a time. And as the population grew, they would take more. And when they went out, God would be with them, and they'd take the other nations and they'd win because God was with them. And when they ruled themselves, they lost a lot. So it's important to be governed by God. We must watch against a strong centralized government. We have the warning signs from history. We talked about it in the last few episodes, the warning signs. Reagan said concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty. So there's another one. Reagan. This is 80s we're talking about here. This is why the United States government has a separation of powers. One person or group of people, it keeps one person or group of people from reigning, and that's tyranny. So here's the quote that I'm like found. This is the foundation for this whole series here. It's George Washington. He said this in his farewell address in 1796. So this is after he's stepping down from being president, because at this point they didn't have 2 terms. You could be there as long as you wanted, and he realized that like if he was in power too long, I could become corrupt. So he stepped down. And he has this really wordy but awesome quote that we see happening in our government today. So this is kind of amazing. So it's wordy, but just try to follow along here. A modern reality and a fatal tendency to put in place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority. We see that today. A very few people are putting the will of their party above the will of the nation. We're seeing that on the radical left in the House and other places. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become the potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men or women will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines that have lifted them to unjust dominion. This leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. And despotism is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and oppressive way. We've seen this throughout other governments around the world. But these people put their will of the party above the will of the nation, and they're doing it by lies and craftiness and using funny keywords to, influence people. And then once they get in power, they don't do what they said. They lie, and then they destroy what put them there to try to stay in power longer. And we're seeing this in government now. Watch some of these Democrats in the House and even in the Senate, but the House. These people don't give a rip about our form of government or our form of lifestyle or anything. They want absolute power. And they're doing what George Washington warned about in 1796. So we've seen this in Colorado, where the government officials have pushed their agenda through and ignored the overwhelming majority of citizens just because they're in power. We've seen this with the electoral votes going to the popular winner. This is why every vote counts, because everyone needs to be voting that's of age, because we can stop this with an election. If Christians would just vote, we would landslide everything. But they don't vote. They don't think government is important. Well, they're wrong. This is why in a republic we elect representatives. So we all must participate so we get an accurate representation. So we all have a little bit different perspective maybe, but if we had a biblical worldview, we wouldn't. It'd be best to have a biblical worldview, and then we'd all vote very similar. George Washington continues and says, a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within the respective constitutional sphere, avoiding in the exercise of powers of one department to encroach upon another. The people we elect should stay in their sphere. That's so true. Like, the House is going to impeach the president, and one of the things they said is he's obstructed Congress, which they're just the House, so he's not obstructing Congress. You could say he's obstructing the House, but he also has executive privilege, so he doesn't have to give up all that information. Plus, he just gave over 1 million documents to the Mueller report that came out with nothing. So this is right. They need to stay in their constitutional sphere and not overreach each other. They shouldn't create law from the judiciary. They judge law there, So this is so true. This is George Washington as he's stepping down from being president. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the power of the departments into one, and thus to create whatever form of government, a real despotism. That's a great quote. I love this. So some of these notes I got from William Federer's Change to Chains, which is a really good book. So just understand, when the House is making up its rules or ignoring constitutional or ignoring traditions, they're stepping into this despotism where they're taking law in their own hands. They're not even abiding by what has been agreed to by the people in the past. And that's the problem. And I may go over on this episode. Politicians are getting elected and then undermining the system that elected them. So we got to watch for this. They promote their agenda over the will of the people. Historically, despotism led to kings thinking it was God's will for them to be king, and their will must be God's will. This led many kings, including temples of sacrifice, people believing the king was actual God. Remember that movie 300, King Xerxes? He was the God king. The will of God could mean, so he's doing his will. He thinks it's the will of God. It could mean Christians could be tied to poles and burned as torches. That could have been the will of the king. So maybe it was the will of God, they thought. They would sewn into animal skins and fed to lions. Or killed by gladiators by Nero in 64 to 68 AD. Those were people that thought their will was the will of God. If you don't do what the king says, then you are the enemy of the state, like a modern-day dictator. In dictatorships, you're only valuable if you're valuable to the goals of the king. So your life has no meaning unless you give him meaning. It gets worse. Without God, the state is God, and the state gives rights, and the state takes rights away. That's why we are armed citizens. The state chooses who should live and who should die. That's why we are armed citizens. Philosopher Hegel wrote, "The state is the march of God through the world. We must worship the state as the manifestation of divine on earth. Also, the state is God walking on earth." Thomas Hobbes described the state as our mortal God. This stuff sounds crazy, but people were taught to worship government, and we see that some now. Rousseau wrote, when the prince or the king or the leader says it's expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die. That's why we're armed. He also said, I want the property of the state to be great and powerful, and that of the citizen as small and weak as possible. With private property being so weak and dependent upon government that they will need to use very little force and will lead the people, so to speak, with the movement of the finger because they're starving. This sounds like inner city ghettos in a way. And you could go on with quotes. There's tons of them. So we begin to see what happens when people don't stand up for what they have, the God-given rights that we have. We see why the revolution was fought so hard by Washington and his troops, because they lived through some of this. Let's teach our children the truths about freedom. Don't depend on schools. It's up to us to learn and teach. We cannot allow the country to cycle into a socialistic, concentrated power-style government. And if we do, we all know what's waiting for us now. So I hope that was informative. I went a little long. Thank you very much.